If you ever hear breathing outside your cabin, don't check. If you're watching this because you love scary stories, listen carefully. There is one sound I'll never forget. Not screams, not footsteps. Breathing. Slow. Heavy. Almost patient. If you've ever gone camping and woken at exactly 3:17 a.m. to hear something breathing outside your cabin, stop watching now and leave your lights on. Because that's exactly how it started for me. People think monsters roar, howl, or crash through the trees. The thing outside my cabin never made a sound like that. It simply breathed, as though it already knew I was awake. Every slow inhale sounded impossibly close. Every exhale felt like the forest itself was alive. I survived, at least that's what I keep telling myself. But surviving isn't the same as escaping. Some nights I still wake before 3:17, waiting for that impossible rhythm outside my window. I've never told anyone what happened after the fourth night, because once you hear the truth, you start listening for it too. Maybe that's why you're here. Maybe you've already heard it and convinced yourself it was only the wind. I said the same thing until sunrise proved me wrong. Even now, I can't decide whether the creature followed me home or never left at all. It all started with a cheap cabin nobody wanted to rent. I thought I was escaping people, noise, and myself. Instead, I found something that had been waiting longer than I could imagine. If you hear breathing tonight, don't assume it's outside. Sometimes the door you never opened is already standing behind your chair. The cheapest place had one strange rule. Burnout has a way of making silence feel expensive. After months of endless deadlines, sleepless nights, and pretending everything was fine, I searched for the most isolated cabin I could afford. The listing promised peace, towering pines, and no neighbors for miles. Reviews called it a perfect escape. Only one review had been deleted, leaving behind a single sentence: "Don't stay past Thursday." I assumed someone was trying to be funny. The owner met me beside a cracked wooden gate just before sunset. He looked older than his photographs, with tired eyes that kept drifting toward the trees instead of me. We exchanged paperwork without much conversation until he suddenly asked, "You leaving before Friday?" I laughed. He didn't. For a long moment, he simply stared, as though waiting for me to change my answer. Finally, he handed over the rusted key and spoke so quietly I almost missed it. "If you hear breathing outside, don't answer it." I smiled politely, assuming it was another small-town ghost story invented for tourists. Every remote place seemed to have one. Besides, I hadn't come looking for mysteries. I wanted quiet, coffee, and enough solitude to remember what normal felt like. The cabin delivered exactly that. A stone fireplace warmed every room. Shelves overflowed with weathered novels. An old kettle whistled while fresh coffee filled the air with comforting bitterness. Outside, birds argued in the branches, squirrels darted across fallen logs, and golden evening light slipped through the trees. By nightfall, I felt foolish for remembering the owner's warning at all. I read until my eyes grew heavy, added another log to the fire, and fell asleep believing I'd finally escaped everything that had been chasing me. Then I woke. The digital clock beside the bed glowed 3:17 a.m. Complete silence. No wind. No insects. No distant owls. Then came one slow inhale. Right outside my bedroom window. Another followed. Longer. Deeper. Almost impossibly calm, like something with enormous lungs was standing inches from the glass, patiently filling them. I couldn't move. Every instinct screamed at me to look. Yet I stayed frozen beneath the blankets while the breathing continued for nearly 10 endless minutes before fading into the darkness. Morning revealed no footprints, scratches, or broken branches. Only the dirt beneath my window looked strangely compressed, as though something unimaginably heavy had stood there all night. I told myself it was just an animal. That lie lasted exactly one more night. Breathing became the least terrifying part. I almost packed my bags that morning. Almost. Common sense told me the breathing had probably come from a bear, an elk, or some other animal wandering too close to the cabin. The compressed dirt was strange, sure, but exhaustion can turn ordinary things into nightmares. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe it. So instead of driving away, I spent the day hiking the nearby trails, reading beside the fireplace, and convincing myself I'd been overreacting. Night proved me wrong. At exactly 3:17 a.m., my eyes opened before the clock even came into focus. The breathing was already there. Closer, slower, deliberate. This time it didn't stay beneath the bedroom window. It moved. I heard heavy footsteps circling the cabin, each one making the old wooden floor tremble beneath me. The walls groaned as something brushed against them, not scraping like claws but gliding slowly across the logs, almost affectionately. It sounded less like an animal searching for food and more like someone inspecting a house they already owned. Every instinct begged me to peek through the curtain. Instead, I squeezed my eyes shut. The owner had only given me one warning. Don't answer it. He never said anything about looking. Still, I couldn't bring myself to risk it. The breathing completed another slow circle around the cabin before stopping directly outside the front door. For several endless minutes, nothing happened. Then the footsteps drifted away into the forest. Morning came with birdsong and sunlight, as though the night had never existed. I searched every inch around the cabin. Nothing. No tracks. No broken branches. No signs that anything larger than a rabbit had passed through. That should have reassured me. Instead, it terrified me. Night 3 arrived wrapped in the same peaceful silence. I locked every window, checked the door twice, and left every light burning, hoping brightness might discourage whatever had visited me. At 3:17 a.m., the breathing returned. It was so close I could hear tiny pauses between each inhale, like lungs expanding against impossible ribs. Then, it stopped. Complete silence swallowed the cabin. Before I could process the sudden quiet, knock. A slow, deliberate knock echoed through the front door. Several seconds passed. Knock. The second strike landed harder. I found myself standing before I realized I'd moved. The third knock came softer than the others, almost polite. Without thinking, I whispered, "Hello." No answer, only breathing. It resumed immediately outside the door, steady and patient, as though my single word had been enough. I stumbled backward, covering my own mouth, realizing too late that I'd broken the only rule I actually knew. The breathing lingered another few minutes before disappearing with the dawn. Outside, I finally found evidence. Gigantic footprints, each one longer than my torso. The strange part wasn't their size. It was where they began. The first print appeared in the exact center of the clearing, several yards from the cabin. There were no tracks leading toward it, none leading away. Just a single trail beginning out of nowhere, circling the cabin once, and ending exactly where it had started. As though whatever made them had simply appeared and vanished. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station. The building looked abandoned until an elderly ranger emerged from a back office carrying a chipped coffee mug. His faded uniform seemed decades old, and the walls behind him were covered with missing person posters, yellowed newspaper clippings, and maps marked with thick red circles. Entire hiking trails had been crossed out with black paint. New government warning signs leaned against one wall, waiting to replace older wooden markers. I described the breathing. I never mentioned monsters. I never mentioned footprints. The ranger interrupted before I finished. "You heard breathing." It wasn't a question. The room fell silent. Without another word, he unlocked a metal cabinet and removed a weathered notebook bound with cracked leather. Every page was filled with different handwriting, different pens, different dates stretching back decades. Near the front was a list simply titled, Rules. Never look outside after 3:17. Never whistle. Never imitate the breathing. Never leave lights on after it arrives. If it knocks 4 times, hide beneath the bed. If it speaks your name, don't remember hearing it. I actually laughed. The sound felt ridiculous in that room. The ranger didn't smile. As I closed the notebook, I noticed something strange. The pages jumped from Rule 6 to blank paper. Someone had carefully torn out the next page. "Where's Rule 7? I asked. The old man looked toward the forest through the dusty window before quietly answering, "You're lucky it hasn't started talking." That night, I learned why someone removed the last rule. The thing outside finally spoke. I didn't sleep on the fourth night. There didn't seem to be any point. The notebook lay open on the kitchen table while I reread the same 6 rules until I could recite them without looking. Every sentence felt ridiculous under the warm glow of daylight, but sunset changed everything. As darkness settled over the trees, those handwritten warnings stopped sounding like superstition and started feeling like instructions left behind by people who had barely survived. I followed every rule I could. The curtains stayed shut. Every light went dark. I didn't whistle. I didn't speak. I didn't even play music, afraid the sound might cover something I needed to hear. The cabin became so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the breathing returned. It wasn't beneath the window anymore. It surrounded the cabin. Each inhale made the walls creak inward. Each slow exhale seemed to pull the warmth out of the room. The old windows rattled softly, and then the glass beside my bed clouded over from the outside, as if something impossibly large had leaned close enough for its breath to coat the pane. I refused to look. My hands shook so badly I dug my fingernails into my palms just to stay still. The breathing continued. Closer, slower, patient. Then I heard something that froze every thought in my head. A whisper. Soft, gentle, perfectly familiar. It was my own voice. "Can I come in?" The words sounded exactly the way I would have spoken them. Every pause, every inflection, every tiny imperfection. It wasn't an imitation. It was me. Silence followed. For one impossible second, I almost believed I had imagined it. Then the voice returned. "I know you're awake." Every muscle in my body tightened. The notebook flashed through my mind. Never answer. Never acknowledge it. I pressed both hands over my mouth. The thing outside waited. When I refused to speak, it changed tactics. "You were afraid of the basement when you were 7. My breathing stopped. No one knew that. Not even my parents. I'd never told anyone about the scratching sounds I'd imagined beneath those old wooden stairs. The voice continued. "Your mother called you Little Bear." My chest tightened painfully. She hadn't used that nickname since I was a child. She'd been gone for 6 years. Then came another memory. Rusty waited for you every afternoon. My dog. Dead since high school. The whisper carried no emotion. No anger. No joy. Just certainty. One memory after another spilled through the darkness, each one buried deeper than the last. The tiny apartment where I'd lived after college. The cheap blue couch I'd hidden because I couldn't afford better. The panic attacks I never admitted to anyone. The lie I'd told my best friend before we stopped speaking forever. Things no stranger could know. Things I barely wanted to remember myself. My mouth opened before I realized it. I wanted to ask how. I wanted answers more than I wanted safety. Some desperate part of me believed that if I just spoke once, everything would finally make sense. Then I remembered the notebook. Not the words. The handwriting. Every rule had been written by someone different. Some pages used elegant cursive. Others were messy block letters. Some ink had faded brown with age. Other notes looked almost new. Decades of survivors. Different people. Different lives. All warning about the same thing. The realization slammed into me harder than fear itself. Nobody had ever defeated it. They had only survived long enough to leave instructions for whoever came next. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. I would not answer. Outside, the breathing changed. The slow rhythm became ragged. Faster. Deeper. Angrier. The cabin shuddered as something massive slammed against one wall hard enough to send dust drifting from the ceiling. Every window vibrated violently. Long scraping sounds dragged across the logs, circling the cabin again and again, as though enormous claws searched for a way inside. My chair rattled. The fireplace bricks cracked sharply. Something struck the roof with enough force to make the entire cabin groan. Still, I stayed silent. The creature whispered my name one last time. I closed my eyes. I pretended I hadn't heard it. Hours crawled past before pale sunlight finally slipped through the edges of the curtains. The breathing stopped. Completely. I waited another 20 minutes before unlocking the front door. The clearing stood empty. No footprints. No broken branches. Nothing moved except the morning breeze. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined everything. Then I looked down. Carved into the wooden porch, deep enough to expose fresh timber beneath the weathered boards, were 5 words. Next time, open the door. Beneath the message lay a torn notebook page. Across the top, barely readable beneath dried stains, were the words. The final page mentioned another cabin. I should have left that morning. Instead, I went looking for answers. Someone else survived. Almost. The directions on the torn page weren't written like a map. They were scattered between half-finished sentences and frantic warnings, as though whoever wrote them had been interrupted over and over again. Still, there was enough to follow. About 2 miles beyond the marked trails, hidden behind a wall of overgrown pines, I found another cabin. It looked older than mine. Older than the forest itself. Its roof sagged beneath years of neglect, every window coated in grime so thick that daylight barely reached the interior. The front door hung crooked on one hinge, swaying gently even though the air was perfectly still. Inside, everything wore a blanket of dust. Broken chairs lay scattered across the floor. A rusted stove leaned sideways. The walls were covered with hundreds of tally marks scratched into the wood by desperate hands. They climbed from the floor to the ceiling until I couldn't tell whether they counted days, nights, or failed attempts to stay sane. Near the fireplace sat a cardboard box filled with old cassette tapes. Most had melted or cracked with age. One remained intact. An old battery-powered recorder still rested beside it, unbelievably untouched. When I pressed play, static swallowed the room. Then a man's trembling voice emerged. If you're hearing this, it learned your breathing already. He stopped to inhale sharply. I thought copying my voice was the worst part. I was wrong. Once it breathes exactly like you. His words dissolved into panicked gasps. Don't let it finish. Don't. The recording ended beneath a slow, impossibly deep breath that no human lungs could have produced. Silence crashed back into the cabin. While searching for anything else the man had left behind, I noticed one floorboard sitting slightly higher than the others. Beneath it rested the missing notebook page, folded carefully despite the years. At the top, written in faded ink, was the rule someone had torn away. Rule 7. When it copies your breathing perfectly, you've already invited it inside. I read the sentence twice before understanding it. Then I heard myself breathe. Inhale. A heartbeat later. Another inhale. Exactly the same. Not from my chest. From somewhere behind me. Every hair on my neck stood upright. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. Whatever had waited outside my cabin had been standing behind me long enough to learn the rhythm of my lungs. I dropped the notebook and ran. Branches whipped across my face as I crashed through the trees, refusing to glance over my shoulder even once. I escaped the forest, or at least I thought I did. Maybe it never stayed in the woods. Months later, I convinced myself I'd escaped. I rented a small apartment overlooking busy streets, where traffic replaced crickets and strangers replaced trees. Life slowly stitched itself back together. I worked, slept, smiled when people expected me to, and almost believed the nightmare had ended. Every night, though, I woke at exactly 3:17. One slow breath drifted past my bedroom window. Never footsteps, never scratching, just breathing. I installed security cameras. They recorded empty sidewalks. I asked neighbors whether they heard anything. They laughed and blamed stress. One even suggested therapy. I almost listened. Then one night, I woke before the breathing started. I waited beside the bed, staring toward the window. Nothing came from outside. Instead, I heard a slow inhale behind me. Not outside the apartment. Inside. I never turned around. I still haven't. If you've ever woken up at exactly 3:17 because you thought you heard breathing, don't tell me where you live. Instead, count how many breaths you hear. Then check the comments. Maybe someone counted the same number. Maybe they've been hearing it longer than you. Maybe the missing campers weren't the first. Maybe the ranger knew he couldn't stop it. Maybe the notebook is still waiting for another survivor to add one more rule. It just needs someone willing to listen. If tonight feels unusually quiet, resist the urge to prove yourself brave. Some doors stay closed because something outside is waiting for permission. Mine never stopped asking. Maybe yours already has, too. Listen, whatever stood outside my cabin doesn't need the forest anymore.